Hi everyone, Alexa here from the blog, theduvallhomestead.com. Today we're going to do something really fun, and that is talk about sourdough bread. Today we're going to talk about sourdough bread, sourdough starter, what happens when you try to create bread and it doesn't work, just kind of an introduction to the world of sourdough and how to best get started and how to troubleshoot when your loaves are not working how you want them to work. Also, I ran an experiment. I made 4 different loaves of bread, all with different characteristics, to try to show how things like flour and water and temperature and proofing all impact your bread. So I'm going to show you that experiment at the end. What we're going to start with is I made a list of bullet points on my phone here of things that I noted down that are helpful for the beginner sourdough maker. I started making sourdough bread several years ago, and I started with a recipe I found online. It was called, sourdough bread for the very beginner. And there were like 35 steps or something, and I printed it off, had it on my counter, and I remember it seemed like the most difficult thing I've ever made in the kitchen before. And I was all excited, and I had this sourdough starter that I had made from scratch, and I thought I was doing everything right. I followed one recipe, and I thought it was the only recipe out there. Then my bread really didn't turn out well at all. Now, I was excited because I still had made the bread, and I was really proud of it, but it was like this thin, and it was very dense, and everyone in my family was like, hey Alexa, really good job making this bread, but it needs to have some bubbles in it, things like that. Well, it took me a few months to establish the process of making bread and figuring out how to in fact get the bread how me and my family like it. During that process, I realized that there is a lot more information on bread making out there than I thought originally. I thought there was only one way to make bread. Turns out there are many ways to make bread. So I'm gonna try to take that knowledge that I've learned, all of the many YouTube videos that I've watched, many articles and books and blogs that I have read on it, and just my personal experience to give you little tidbits of knowledge that will help you in your sourdough journey too. I'm not an expert sourdough maker. No one really is. Sourdough, if you haven't ever tried it, is basically a science experiment. So you will get the hang of it. It will work for you eventually, but it is a matter of science and chemistry, and there's a certain amount of it that you just need to figure out on your own. Just because you follow a recipe doesn't mean that it's going to work. So I think that's already one of my points. So we're going to just dive into these bullet points, and then I'll show you the experiment. Bullet point number 1, someone else's recipe may work for them, but it may not work for you because they have a different scale, different flour, different air quality in their house, different water quality, different temperature in their house. Factors that impact your sourdough bread are flour, water, temperature in your house, and your process. How long it sits for, where do you proof it, how long do you proof it, do you do stretch and folds, how do you do that? So when you see that someone has made sourdough bread and they're sharing their recipe with you and they say this is tried and true, it will definitely work, you might do it and it may not work, and it might be because you have a very different flour than they do. Maybe your flour is heavier or lighter. That is for you to find out, and that is why this journey is really supposed to be fun and exciting and not frustrating. If you do feel frustrated, you're not alone. Everybody who starts with sourdough or has been experimenting with sourdough has a second of frustration when they think something's gonna work and then it doesn't. Oh, and one more reason why someone else's recipe might work and yours wouldn't is because of their starter. So they might say half a cup sourdough starter, but their sourdough starter was fed with 1 cup flour, 1 cup water. Your starter may be fed with 1 cup flour, 3/4 cup water. So you see what I'm saying? Your starters may not even be starting at the same point. Okay, next. When you first make your dough, it's going to be very sticky. As it ferments and proofs throughout the next, say, 48 hours, it will become more round and more dough-like. If you're looking at your dough and it's so sticky, it's all over your hands, you're probably doing it right. That is how it starts. When you are working with the dough, it's very sticky and very confusing at first, and you will get the hang of it. But the first lift and tuck that you do, you have to be kind of aggressive. I like to get my hands like this, point your hands down into the bowl, get your fingers underneath the dough, and then, see if I can get it in the camera, fingers underneath the dough on the bottom of the bowl, and then you pull up through the center and distribute the flour. And all you're doing is just distributing the flour, distributing the gluten and the water, the salt, And that's kind of the motion that I use and that I recommend for the beginning of the dough when you are still trying to make sure it's fully incorporated. If you don't know how to work with the dough at the beginning, it might get clumped up, flour in one place, starter in one place. So it is important that you mix the dough properly at the beginning. During the later lift and tucks, or stretch and folds. If you don't know what I'm talking about, what these are is basically you have to distribute the dough and distribute the gluten so that it can spread and rise throughout the proofing process. People call it stretch and folds, lift and fold, lift and tuck. There's a lot of different words for it. It's all basically the same thing. But during the later processes, when your dough is more handleable, you can do this one of two ways. You can lift up the dough with one hand and kind of get it vertical when pressing down with the other hand, and then fold it on top. So it's like you're picking it up, folding it over, picking it up, folding it over. Another way you can do it, which is my favorite way that I've been doing a lot recently, is I pick up the whole dough on its own and I just kind of shake the entire thing, and I work my way around the dough, shaking it as one, and then I take all the corners and fold them down into the center. And in that way I'm creating a dough. So I'm lifting the whole thing up, stretching it out along the whole dough, and then tucking it underneath itself and creating a dough. In a way, what I'm doing there is I'm shaping the dough early in the process as opposed to later. I do shape it later as well, but I'm getting it started and shaped earlier. That's just how kind of I do it. Okay, think of the sourdough starter like an ingredient that you don't feed unless you're making a recipe. So a lot of times I see people say, what do I do with all my leftover sourdough starter? If you have starter, you know that in order to use it, you have to feed it. In order to feed it, you have to make more of it. And so the question remains in people's heads, what do I do with all this starter that I'm not using? And the answer is you shouldn't have starter that you're not using. So if you're going to feed the starter, it means you're going to use the starter. When you go to feed your starter, that is the start of your recipe. So you wouldn't be feeding your starter unless you're going to be incorporating it in a recipe. Hope that makes sense. Now on the note of sourdough starter, I feed my sourdough starter 1 cup flour and 3/4 cup water. This gives my starter a nice thick, like thicker than pancake dough kind of consistency, but it's not runny and it's not so thick that it is feeling like dough on itself. Okay, back with Allison on my back now, which she's gonna enjoy. Okay, so the next point has to do with temperature. So the temperature in your air impacts your sourdough bread more than you probably know. So think of it like this. The dough ferments at a rate of about 1 hour in heat to 2 hours in a colder house temperature. So if it's 80 degrees outside or in your house, the dough will ferment for 1 hour at 80 degrees, the same amount that it would ferment 2 hours in maybe 70. So if you have a really warm summer day, your bread making process is gonna look totally different than if you were making a bread in the winter. If your house is 65, you're gonna have to let the bread sit longer versus if your house was 75. So whenever you're following a recipe, keep in mind that when was that recipe made, what temperature is in your house. On the conservative side, I will say that it's usually the longer you can let your bread sit, the better. The warmer it is in your house, the better. However, I've had one time when it was actually too hot, and if you set the bread out for too long, it will eventually over ferment, it will reach its peak and go back down. It's only happened to me one time though, so it takes a lot of heat to make that happen. Now, how do you get your house warm enough to make bread if it's not normally that warm? So we keep our house about 65 degrees, which is not a great temperature for bread, but I always keep my bread right next to the stove, right on the stove if there's room. So it's getting all the heat from when I'm cooking all day. And I also have an oven, and this is one thing you can do if you're not home all day, is you can turn the oven on and then turn it off. And then when it's in that process of cooling down, you can throw your dough in there for 30 minutes and see what happens when you're exposing your dough to heat during the fermentation process. But if you have been trying to make bread for a long time and they keep turning out small and you're sure that your starter is ready, it might just be that your house is too cold. And that brings me to another point, which I haven't said yet, but the starter that you're using has to be ready for bread making. So how do you know when your starter is ready is it has to pass the float test. And this means that a spoonful of starter has to float in a cup of water. A couple points about this float test though. First of all, you do not need to stir your starter. When you feed your starter and it's been sitting on the counter all day, you want to let those bubbles form. So if you go in there with a spoon and you stir everything up, you might deflate the starter and then it may not pass the float test even when it was maybe good enough a little while ago. So if you find yourself stirring the starter, stop, let it sit for 30 minutes to an hour, get those bubbles back, then try the float test again. I would use a whole spoonful, not just a tiny, tiny bit, because a tiny bit would float maybe regardless. Also, you don't need to use too much because it will sink. Now, a couple times you might notice that during the float test, the starter will fall to the bottom and then it will start to rise back up halfway up the glass and then go back down to the bottom. So this means it's not ready yet. It means it's almost ready, but not yet. So I would recommend keeping it on the counter or wherever for at least another hour. Try again in an hour or two. A good timeline that I usually think of is I take my starter out of the fridge in the morning, I feed it, let's say 9 or 10 a.m., and then it's usually ready for bread making about 3 p.m. Now, if it's hot out, it'll be ready by noon. If it's really cold out, it'll be ready by 5 p.m. So that's a big difference, right? It's a big range. So just know that the temperature really matters, and you do need to make sure your starter is ready and passes the float test. A lot of times I see people say, you want your starters to be really bubbly and have doubled in size, and that's all good things to look at, but if it does not float in water, I'm telling you it will not float in the bread. Very important. Okay. I'm gonna try and get through these points quickly because this is getting long. Next, you need at least one deep score. You can use a serrated knife, but don't skip this step. It's an important step. So when you're scoring the bread, you need to get deep. So I would say maybe 1/2 inch to 1 inch and at least one spot. I like to use a good old serrated knife for this. A lot of bread makers say this is not a good scoring tool. I just disagree. I love scoring with this. I do 2 big scores. Now you can also use a bread scoring tool like this. I am less experienced with this. I'm learning though because I'm interested in it, but the thing you need to watch out for is this is a lot smaller, and if you make little tiny marks in the bread because you're trying to make a pretty pattern, you do need to get a deep score somewhere because it's got to let kind of the heat and the air out of the bread while it bakes. So you can do this, just make sure you're also doing a deep one. So maybe you can use both. I just use this, it's so easy. I do 2 scores and it goes in the oven. But I'm baking quickly, I'm a mom, I'm just trying to get bread on the table. I'm not trying to make the most beautiful bread, so that's where I'm coming from. Okay, using a plastic cover versus a cloth over the dough. You might see people putting a little towel over their dough as it ferments. Some people put plastic cover or shower cap. You can use any of those things, but here are a couple notes about them. So the plastic cover is good for if it's going overnight in the fridge for a long ferment. The plastic cover prevents air from getting in, so it prevents the top from drying out. The towel allows air to get to the dough, which can be a good thing if you're trying to cultivate the bacteria and the yeast and everything during the fermentation process. Okay, always keep plastic on the loaf when you are not using it. So when you take your loaf out of the oven, it's going to be very hot. You want to let it sit for at least an hour. You'll hear crackling noise because the bread is still baking at that point, even though it's out of the oven. Once it is out of the oven, you want to let it sit, cool completely for a couple hours, and then you want to put it in plastic wrap. Now, I do this once the dough is already cooled down, so there's no risk of warmth hitting the plastic, and you definitely don't want any warmth around that plastic because it will create moisture. And you don't want your loaf to be wet either. So how I put the plastic on is I make a T shape. So I do a vertical piece of plastic and a horizontal piece of plastic and then wrap them both around the dough so that the whole thing is covered. And I keep it on my counter for up to a whole week, so a whole 7 days. Now it doesn't usually last that long because we eat it, but it could last a whole 7 days, and it has in the past when we've gone out of town or something, we come back and it's still there and it's still good. I don't put it in the fridge, but I do keep plastic on it. So if you do slice it up for a Sunday morning brunch or something, just make sure you wrap that plastic back. So if you leave it on the counter all day without any plastic on it, it will definitely dry out. Okay, the last few are a couple tips when you are working out your sourdough schedule, which is something that happens kind of naturally in time. You will work out a schedule that works for you depending on what you have to do during the day, weekends, weekdays. One tip I have for a sourdough schedule is to make several doughs when you take out your starter. So take your starter out whenever you have a day where you have time, feed it in the morning, and then it'll be ready in the afternoon, and make a bread dough, make a pizza dough, pancake dough, make a bagel dough. Just make all the doughs that you want at that time and then let them ferment on the counter. That way you only fed your starter once, although I should caveat that because if you're gonna make, let's say you're gonna make 3 doughs, I would feed your starter 2 to 3 times the amount you normally would. So I always feed 1 cup flour, 3/4 cup water, but if I'm going to be making 2 or 3 doughs, I will double that feeding because you're going to be taking it out. So you have to do the math a little bit, but the point is you're only doing the process once and then you have doughs for the whole week, which is what I do. Okay, this tip is for if you're frustrated with sourdough bread and you're wanting to just quit because you don't get it. Here's what I recommend. Try a different recipe, like not bread. Try bagels or pizza crust or English muffins or even cookies. I have a sourdough cookie recipe with einkorn flour. It is so good and you can't mess it up because it doesn't require any rising. But the benefit of doing a different recipe like bagels or pizza crust is it's just getting you used to working with the dough, and when you see how that dough looks different than the bread dough, you might learn more about your bread dough. So don't just get obsessed with bread. I would venture out with other recipes. Okay, my last tip has to do with sourdough starter, and that is that everyone always says you should have all these bubbles in your starter. And that is true. However, I touched on this a little bit earlier. You want to have big bubbles. So if you have a bunch of little tiny bubbles, that could mean your starter is almost active, or it could mean that it is actually hungry. You want to look for a big bubble that is almost like a little mountain on top of your starter. Those are the bubbles that will allow it to rise and that will allow the starter to pass the float test. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about my sourdough experiment. So I made 4 loaves of bread, and the first 2 were comparing the dough, and I compared a wet dough to a dry dough. First dough I did was my regular recipe plus a little more flour, so I wanted to create a more dense dough. The second dough was my recipe, but a little less flour and a little more water, so I wanted a more wet dough. The wet dough was a lot more sticky. When you poked your finger into it, it really went all the way into the dough and it was kind of hard to get back out, whereas the drier dough was a lot more tough. When you poke your finger in it, it would bounce right back out. This is the dough with my regular recipe. This is the dough with higher water content. So you can see this one is kind of sliding down the bowl. This one is staying pretty firm. Now I'm going to shape both these doughs because they're both going to be baked today. So you can see this dough is pretty thick. This is the one that's got a more watery consistency, and I'm kind of having to drag it out of the bowl. Very, very sticky and not forming into a dough very much, so I'm gonna try to form it the best I can. I sprinkled a little bit of flour on the countertop first. Super springy and just very, very light. Same shaping process as the other one, only this one just is very pliable and moves a lot easier. Really, for this one, it's more important to be doing these twists because what I'm doing is I'm knotting up the bottom. I'm creating a knot underneath the dough here by doing these twists. So it's kind of becoming knotted at the underside of it. Here are the 2 doughs, the wet dough and then the drier dough. Okay, now we're going to start with scoring the really wet dough, which is very loose and pokey when I poke into it. It really not very firm, and you can see that it is a little bit on the flat side because there's so much water in it. So a lot of people wonder how to score sourdough. Sorry, I had some bagel seasoning for I just made sourdough bagels. I'll show you my countertop right now. That was our lunch, so good. I'm gonna do one down the middle, and it's kind of hard to score. You really have to pull hard, and I do use kind of the tip of the bread knife to get deep enough. You want to get, see, now this is a lot harder to score than my other dough. This doesn't look like it's going to work very well to me, to be honest with you, because I can't even get a good cut on this bread. which is why I think it's just too wet. Now I'm scoring the dough that had a little bit more flour, so it's just not nearly as squishy as the really wet dough, and it also holds its shape a lot better. So as you can see, it's more round, it's not as flat, and it's got more of a shape to it. This is a lot easier to score than the last one, because the dough is just thicker. You can really get in here, so we'll see what happens. Okay, this is the loaf that had more flour in it. So biggest difference I can see so far is it's just super round, like perfectly circular. Definitely got a good height to it. When you compare the two, you can just see basically it's a shape difference. I'd say the height is pretty much the same at the very top. This one kind of slopes down quickly. This one stays pretty round at the top. And here they are when they are cut open. I don't notice a huge difference in the bubbles. Possibly the wetter dough has more bubbles, but it's hard to say because it seems like there are more small bubbles, whereas the drier dough has a couple really big ones. After baking, the drier dough was a nice round, tight circle dough. The wetter dough was more of a triangle shape. A good thing to remember with sourdough is it's kind of like wine. If you like the wine, it doesn't matter if it's expensive or cheap. You could drink a $5 bottle of wine or a $50 bottle of wine, and if you like the $5 bottle, that's the one you should drink. So if you like your bread a certain way, that's how you should make it. There is no right way. Okay, my next experiment was with temperature. So I used the same ingredients. I made 2 doughs with the exact same ingredients, and then I just let one proof at a warmer temperature and one proof at a colder temperature for roughly the same amount of time. Okay, so the warmer dough is on the left and the colder one is on the right. See, the warmer dough is a little bit bigger. It just got a bigger ferment than the colder dough. This dough is the one that had a warmer proof time, and this one had a colder proof temperature. This one is more wide, it got bigger, it got more fermented. This one is a little bit smaller. But again, they both look great. It's just clear that the warmer temperature does allow the bread to rise bigger. So the key takeaways from the experiment I did were that a drier dough with more flour will be a little bit more dense and a little easier to do stretch and folds because it's more easy to hold. A wetter dough will turn out a little more triangular, but it might have really good air pockets and bubbles in it. But it won't be as high up and well risen. It'll be more triangular. A dough that gets to proof at about 80 degrees for about 4 to 5 hours will do better than a dough that proofs at the same amount of time at about 70 degrees. So if you can proof at about 75 to 80 degrees, you'll get a better dough. Just don't let it proof all day because it will overproof. Alright, I'm hopping back on this video because I realized I should have done an FAQ on my Instagram account because a lot of people on social media post bread pictures, they ask questions, and I said, okay, give me all your questions, and so I got a couple that I wanted to share with you all from Instagram. So the first one is, why is my sourdough dry and falling apart by day 2 or 3? That's an interesting question. I've never had that happen for sourdough starter, but I've only made sourdough starter one time because you only need to make it one time. But I would say if it's too dry, it needs water. So I don't know what recipe that is, but I would feed your starter about 1 cup of flour, 3/4 cup water. And it sounds like in that recipe, there's just simply not enough water if it's so dry. Next question is how to make sourdough bread less sour. This is a funny question because usually people are asking how to make it more sour. I don't know exactly the answer to this one, but I would say just don't ferment it as much. I don't know, I'd have to ask, well, how long you're fermenting it, what temperature your house is, that kind of thing. It sounds like you have a really nice fermented bread if you're getting that nice sour flavor. So you could keep it in the fridge or just bake it quicker, less fermentation time, that might help. But I say that's a pretty good problem to have. Next, a video on starting and maintaining the starter. I want to start, but I'm scared. So first of all, don't be scared. But I do have a video on YouTube about how to start a sourdough starter. It takes about 2 weeks. It's very easy. All you're doing is adding flour and water and then taking some out, add more flour and water, taking some out, and you're creating like a culture of bacteria within the flour and water. That's why you keep feeding it and removing it, so that you're creating a concentrated bacteria that's alive and going to cultivate your bread. So it's really not hard. And then once you have the starter, you can use it in many different things. So I will link below the tutorial on how to do that on my blog, and I also have a YouTube video. And last question, any thoughts and tricks for a gluten-free starter? No, and I've heard this question asked before. I have seen a couple people try to do this, whether it's on YouTube or Instagram. I don't have a gluten intolerance, so I have never ventured into that world. If I did, I'd probably just use the 1-for-1 gluten-free flour and see how that did. However, I can say that if you are gluten sensitive, that sourdough might digest better for you anyway because it's fermented grain, which is easier to digest. So you might want to try it, but if you're gluten intolerant, I don't know, and I'm not a medical professional, so obviously I can't answer that. But I'd give it a go. Just use that gluten-free flour, same thing, flour and water, and you'll have to eyeball it, see if it's growing and cultivating that bacteria over a couple of weeks. I have heard of people doing this and being successful, but I haven't done it myself. All right, well, I hope these tips were helpful to you in learning how to make sourdough, understanding that it's a process, and everyone who's ever making sourdough is constantly learning, trying new recipes and getting better. And really, no dough is a bad dough. So if you like it, if you're enjoying it, that's what's most important. And if you do have a really flat or dense dough that you don't like, I suggest just cutting it up, making it into croutons or garlic bread, like thin strips, put in the oven with some garlic and salt on it. People love that, and they have no idea that that was just a sourdough loaf of bread that you thought didn't turn out, because they love it. I will leave a few links below to some of my favorite sourdough recipes that I've made. I have a bread recipe, a bagel recipe, pizza crust, and a few others. If you're brand new to my channel, please hit that subscribe button. Every week I post a new video on farm-to-table recipes and homemade natural living, and of course, lots of sourdough. Thank you so much for stopping by the Duvall Homestead.